Well, let's get to it right away. And here is John Mark Comer from Portland, Oregon. Hey, John Mark, great to see you. And what's the weather like right there, right now?
Oh, you had to start with a question about the weather. From a Hawaiian island to Portland, Oregon, it's exactly what you would expect. Horrible. No, actually, today is not that bad. The blue sky just came out, which in December, right now, as we record, is no small miracle at all.
Well, I love Portland. I actually went to undergrad school at Lewis and Clark College in Portland,
No
Oregon.
way. Are you
Yeah,
serious?
yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's
I just
just out there.
love Portland, and you know what's really crazy is everybody is that John Mark and I have so many common friends. It's just unbelievable, and many many of the names. John Tyson, Mike Pilavachi, Tom Smith, Luke and Anna Hellebroth, who are worship leaders, John Ortberg, Ronald Rollhauser, just a lot of intersections. So it's amazing. John Mark, I've heard so much about you. You're like in the Hall of Fame, and I haven't even met you yet. It's so
Oh my
nice.
God. You need to get out, Dan Moore. That island fever is getting to you or something,
Oh,
but I'll take it.
And just loved your latest ebook. We don't know what's going to happen, and that's okay. Living in holy uncertainty, and what a perfect thing for us to talk about today, because we're in the
Yes.
season of Advent, aren't we? A time of
Yes.
waiting for the
Hmm.
Messiah to come, and I just think we're gonna hear a lot of great stuff and talk about it. So. And interesting, your latest book, you made it available for free in an ebook. I mean, that's kind of counterintuitive. Why did you do that?
Well, I don't book is maybe a little bit too a little bit too much hubris maybe in the word. It's just a little ebook. But yeah, I think my aim over the last, season has just been as pastor to just help do anything I can to help people kind of ground themselves in the peace and the presence of God. So, we did a daily podcast for a while and just anything I can do at all. A lot of my teaching has been less about kind of vision for the church or whatever, more about just helping people attend to their anxiety, to their body, to the uncertainty of the moment, to the grief and loss that so many people have been living through. And how do we do that in prayer? Like really just processing all of that before God. And I think at some level, that's really the role of the pastor, or at least a role of the pastor, to help people ground themselves in God.
That is so cool. And you have, through your writings, you're just trying to help so many people. You wrote The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry and Living in Holy.
Yes.
Love that one. God has a name, Garden City, Loveology, great name. Uh, and so let's talk. I want to talk about your latest book too, but
Yeah.
uh, so, but you know, John Mark, a lot of people may not know much about your ministry path and about your family. So tell us a little bit about your church, Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, that you founded, you said 17 years ago. Was that it?
Yeah, yeah, we've been here a little over 17 years. We're right in the urban core of Portland, Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest of America. And just really, I live here with my wife. We have three children. We started kind of everything young. So our oldest is already in high school, and we've been at the church for 17, going on 18 years. And we love it, but it's a hard place. Not that there is such a thing as an easy place, but it is a hard place to follow Jesus, much less to pastor a church. And in a sense, that's really good. It's like resistance training. What's the saying from the workout world? The resistance is good for you. And so there is something to that. The resistance is good for you. And I think my great question, I do in theory lead a church along with a team of other leaders, but really I'm kind of a teacher and spiritual director at heart. And I think my great question in life is just how do we follow Jesus? And how do we actually grow and mature into the kind of people that Jesus has in mind? And the kind of people, if life is a school for becoming a person of agape, becoming a person of love and joy and peace and hope, as we think about Advent, what's the process by which we actually become, you could put platitudes in like, well, it's just the Spirit of God or whatever, and that's true at a theological level. but it's not true at a practical level. Like how do we say yes to the work of the Spirit of God in our soul to transform us? And that's really the, I think, driving question of my life and work.
Well, Portland's a great town, and I love Portland when I went to school there. And of course, more recently in 2020, Portland has really been in the news. Talk about resistance and a lot of different
Yes,
issues and cordoning
very
off
hard.
certain parts of the city. But you felt called 17 years ago to become a pastor, to found a church. Why did you want to do that as opposed to some other form of ministry? And in your mind, what did you hope your church would do that might be a little different than other churches? Um,
Well, I'm not sure want is the right reason, at least not when I started. I'm not sure I was mature enough to want to plant a church. I was playing in a band. I wanted to be a rock star. So that was my life trajectory. We had just signed to a record label. It was a dream come true. And I thought I was off to tour and do that whole thing. And I, in all honesty, just had an encounter with God. I don't know how, I've only had this happen to me at this level, this acute, a few times in my life. But where I really felt the Spirit of God say, quit the band, move to Portland, start a church. I mean, as almost an inaudible voice, but not quite. And that's not common for me. That does not happen every morning or every Tuesday, but it was a watershed moment. I grew up behind the scenes of the church. My dad was a pastor. So I've been around kind of the pastoral world my entire life, and was not anti, it just was not really up my alley. I'm an introvert by nature and a creative, and it was not kind of at the top of my desire list, But then once God started to generate that, desire is maybe too strong of a word, though it became that, more just a sense of call, like to not do it felt like it would be to break a part of my integrity, to go against the call of God on my life. I don't even know how to put it into language. It would have felt like sin, even though it's not sin to go do something else, obviously. But I think what the desire turned into, and why Portland, when there are a lot of easier and other places to go, was I just think, the West is becoming increasingly secular on both the left and the right. And you see that in Oahu, it's very similar to a Portland, different culture, but in the level of secularization. And a lot of the church models that we look to and kind of promote are ones that are designed for less secular cultural contexts. And that's fine. That's not a bad thing. But I want to be a part of, what does the church look like in the future? And, even if my ministry is just the asking of a question, and not even getting to all the best answers, how could we hand off to my children and their children something that is viable? How does America not go the way of some of the other Western European countries that have just secularized so far and so hard that it's really rare to find a robust church anywhere? And so I think that's what's appealing to me about Portland. There's no cultural Christianity here. It's just all burned up. And so there's a gift in that, and that the only kind of life with Jesus that will survive here is a really robust and resilient kind of discipleship to Jesus in community and in the Spirit and grounded in Scripture and all of that. So that is really appealing to me.
Well, I love that. I loved how you said you hope at least to ask the right questions and know how to phrase it. And I think if we can ask the right questions, hopefully we can work with people to figuring out the answer and how God fits in there. I can see why you're really one of the leaders of the millennial generation and why you're so popular. And I'm really happy that you agreed to be one of our general session speakers at Hawaiian Ministries 2021, which will be happening next March. And so thank you so much for that. So let's talk about your book. In your book, your latest book, you talk about perhaps we're battling with a low tolerance for uncertainty. And
yes,
what a time of uncertainty with wildfires, both in Hawaii as well as in California, and COVID and racial tension. And there's a little presidential election that snuck into town.
Yeah,
Some of us
minor
noticed that one
detail.
too. And boy, just lots of unknown. And yet you're asserting that Americans have a low tolerance for uncertainty. And so tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, I've just found myself over the last 9 months saying more than ever before, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, you know? And there's so much like, you know, all year long, it's been, what do you think's going to happen? When will they let us back out? When will the vaccine come? Who's going to win the election? Will there be a peaceful transfer of power? What's going to, you know, about 1,000 different things. And I just found myself saying over and over and over again, the only thing I could say, I don't know what's going to happen. And that the production in my at an emotional level was a lot of uncertainty, you know, and uncertainty is more than the name, I think, sounds. Uncertainty. It's not just the lack or the absence of certainty, it's the presence of fear and even of dread, you know what I mean, over what's going to happen. And the fear is that the next shoe is going to drop and yet another bad thing is going to happen. And I just think if you, like myself, and this is not all, I'm sure, with us online, but if you grew up at all in kind of an American context, if you grew up at all kind of middle class, then we are used to a very high level at a kind of relative international, by if there were a scale for certainty that was international, we are used to a very high level of certainty. Think about the role of planning in kind of Western culture and American culture, and even a lot of Asian culture right now. You have a high value for planning, and planning only makes sense in a world where there's enough certainty that you can make a prediction about what is going to happen in the wider world, and then you can plan your life, work, schedule all around that prediction. And so, you know, what we're experiencing in Hawaii or Portland in America is very similar to how many people have lived since they were born in much of the world. If you're living in Syria right now, or even somewhere not as extreme in much of the developing world, there's still there's very low sense of certainty around the future. And planning is very different. It is a phenomenon of basically of the middle class and up. So for a lot of us, this is our first experience of really living with a high level of uncertainty, an inability to plan, a lack of, you know, ability to really even figure out what's going to happen and plan. Right now, I'm trying to plan my schedule for 2021, and it's a bit of an exercise in comedy. You know, I just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the uncertainty is overwhelming. It's a tidal wave of uncertainty, and yet it really is a big challenge to us, isn't it? Because if you think of our worship and some of our songs, and we sing about, we give it all to you, God, and you know, you're the air we breathe, and yet we may not really be following through with what we're singing. And so it's a real gut check, right? That are we meaning what we sing, the lyrics that we use? And is it almost incriminating at some point that we're kind of on the precipice of hypocrisy to the max? And yet we struggle with this uncertainty.
Yeah, you know, and that's where psychologists distinguish between grief and trauma. And, you know, grief is obviously when something painful but normal happens to you. Trauma, they would argue, is one, it's different in intensity, and two, it's different in its kind of duration. There's no clear end in sight. And most psychologists would argue that 2020 has been at least traumatic in the adjectival sense for people, because there's just not a clear end in sight. And, you know, if you know anything about trauma, the hallmark emotional feeling of trauma is powerlessness. People just don't feel like they have any power or control over their body, over their food, over their situation, over their dignity, over, you know, their life. And so what often happens with trauma survivors is they begin to grasp for power and control in other areas of their life in both healthy and unhealthy ways. And so we're seeing a lot of that kind of across the general population of people just grasping for control. And this could look like anything. Blame shifting is a common example of this, you know what I mean? Because if you can blame someone, if you can scapegoat, and you can blame the trauma on the right or the left or President Trump or liberal elites or China or you fill in the blank, then you can feel in control of the situation. Another would be magical thinking, like just take this pill and you're safe, or it's just the flu, or, you know, whatever it is. If we can bend reality in our mind, we can feel in control again. Prediction is another common one where people are like, this is going to happen, you know, which is just another kind of grasping for control. And then there's the more common examples of just like obsessive compulsive reading of the news multiple times a day, you know, or over cleaning your house, you know, or being tyrannical with your spouse or your children or whatever. I think these are just coping mechanisms that we as humans and as disciples of Jesus come up with to deal with this sense of just feeling so powerless and so out of control of our future, and so out of control of when this will end and what that will even look like. But I actually think there is a chance here. This is liminal space, and this could be one of the most profound moments in our spiritual formation, because I think control is really at the root of what's wrong with the human condition. At the root of sin is a lack of trust in God and an attempt to seize control for your own life.
You know, that was mind-blowing for me to read in your latest book. It never occurred to me about the sin or the addiction towards control as being part of the reason there's so much strife in our, at least in our nation, right now. And I was, you know, blaming a lot of it, as we've read, on social media, you know, but they figure out through their algorithms, oh, you like that, and they just bombard you with only your group think. So there's kind of
the echo chamber.
Right. But it never occurred to me. I mean, you wrote this great quote, control is the issue underneath so many of the issues that block and hamper and derail our spiritual formation into people of love, joy, and peace. And that was mind-blowing for me, that I've always thought, as scripture says, you know, money is the root, or the love of money is the root of all evil, but maybe it's the love of money and control is the root of all evil.
Well,
and the love of
scripture says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. But why do people love money? Nobody loves green paper. Right. Nobody loves number. Like, what do people love money for? They love what it can give you. And for a lot of people, that is a sense of control over your life and your future. I know I have so many, I'm 40 now, you know, so I have so many of my friends who have said to me over the last 2 years, I just want to be independently wealthy. I don't want to be rich or anything. I just kind of want to not have to worry about where my money comes from. And on one hand, it's not an option for me right now, but I have empathy for that. On the other hand, I just think that is you're looking for a false sense of security. You're looking for money to give you something that no longer requires you to live by faith. And none of us want to live by faith. We all would much rather live by control, but it doesn't work.
Now, you have 3 children. How do we cultivate trust in our children as opposed to control? Tough question, I know.
Oh, well, actually, I mean, I think this is where parenting is so important, because if children receive, like, we know anything about attachment theory, you know, which is something I've been learning a lot about over the last few years, because I think it has extraordinary implications for our discipleship to Jesus and for church, how we do relationships in church. And the basic premise there, some neuroscientists are arguing that the attachment system in your brain, which comes online when you're still in your mother's womb and is, you know, firing up as you're an infant, when you're breastfeeding at your mom's chest and you're making eye contact and you're looking at her and you're literally receiving nourishment from her in a ideal scenario, that your attachment system is being developed in the neurochemistry of your body. And a number of scientists are arguing it's the strongest system, so to speak, in your brain, right? There's a whole even theological movement to argue that love in the New Testament is attachment love. That I read one guy recently who called it soteriology by salvation by attachment love to Jesus. It's just beautiful. But what happens is when you experience healthy, not perfect, just healthy kind of family of origin dynamic, your brain and your body learn that the world is a basically safe and good place. Yes, there are dangerous things and dangerous people out there, but most people are good and safe, and you can trust them, and you can go out and explore into the world. And home becomes this beautiful place of both belonging and becoming, right? We have a place to belong where we feel safe. And, you know, in Jungian psychology, the mother's role is to make us feel safe and nurtured, or the father's role is to empower us to go out. whether or not that's true or not. It's that both and of like feeling safe and at home and nurtured, and at the same time feeling empowered to go out and explore the world and then come back. The problem is that all families are dysfunctional. You know, and they have been ever since Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And so some families do a much better job with this, but an increasing number, particularly with the breakdown of the family and the fallout of the sexual revolution since the 1960s in our country and beyond, an increasing number of people don't grow up with a mother and a father and a safe, loving environment and time and attention. And so that part of our brain that is designed by God to experience safety and love and security and empowerment doesn't get that. And then it sabotages the way that we live as an adult. You know, it sabotages our relationship with our God that we call Father, with our spouse someday, any kind of intimate relationships, with our church, with our pastor, with one another. And so at some point, you know, being a part of the church or the family of God is about being reparented into the healing of this part of our body and our brain and relearning our capacity for trust. So that's a long way of saying, I think, you know, in an ideal world, as parents, we love our kids, not in a perfect way, that's not on the table as long as sin is in our body, but in such a way that they grow up with a strong capacity for trust and to feel safe and okay in the world with God.
And, you know, if I could add to that, maybe it's the journey of trust. You know, I'm trying to play in my mind, how do we form parents who provide this environment of safety, but yet not smothering, right? Where you catch them before they skin their knees kind of thing. And I remember talking to a church leader, and he said, you know, one of the greatest things we can do, and I'd love to know what you think about this. He was saying that too often when we talk to our kids, they don't see the process of uncertainty or the process of trying to figure this out with God. And so a dad says, oh, we're moving to Kansas. And they go, what? You know, the kids go, we're moving to Kansas? He goes, yeah, I prayed about it, and we're doing that.
Yeah.
And this leader was saying, we need to bring our kids along, especially if they're teenagers, along through it, saying, you know, I feel we might need to be moving. Can we pray about this? And then they kind of see that uncertainty and
agency. Yep.
I'm going to take a drink of water. What do you think of that? While I
absolutely. I feel like that's a rabbit trail. I want to discipline myself not to go down, because I think decision making from Christians in our kind of cultural context is a travesty. Most people don't have a concept for communal decision making and waiting on God. It's like, hey, I prayed about it, I decided to do this. And I'm just shocked at the level of decisions that people make, you know, maybe just chatting to their spouse or something. I'm just shocked by it, you know? So that's a whole rabbit trail. But I do agree. And I think parenting is key here. You know, the other thing that, especially for millennials, where helicopter parenting is so the norm, is the most, you know, my understanding is the most common command in all of Scripture is do not fear. If I have the story right, in the Christmas story, if you synthesize the Gospels, there's one command through the entire Christmas story, and it's repeated 4 times, and it's the same one: do not fear. And fear is just, man, fear and control are in a locked relationship, right? So our grasping for control is based on fear. And so much of parenting does more to instill fear in children than it does to help children overcome fear and develop resiliency about it, you know? And a lot of it's well-meaning parenting. You know, who of us want our kids to fall out of the tree and, you know, break their arm? But at the end of the day, it's much more dangerous for a child to be scared of climbing a tree than it is for a child to break their arm or their leg. That one they will recover from, the other will be much harder to recover from, you know?
Right.
So I think, how do we parent in such a way that we increase our children's capacity to live without control, without fear, in uncertainty, rather than in an attempt to keep them safe, we actually smother them in fear?
So here's the issue. I you know, you shed a whole new light on the control issue for all of us.
Yes.
But in essence, if you're really into control, that means you're really going to resist faith. Because faith means you have to give up control. And that's a dilemma for us, right? I mean, if we are so much into control, will that make us incapable of great faith? And
right.
And, you know, the Israelites, right, see the parting of the sea, they see manna on the ground, they have birds from the air, they have water from a rock, pillars of fire, pillars of smoke, and still they resisted faith and murmured in the wilderness for decades.
Yes,
So, I
yes.
mean, what does that all mean? Are we like, are we dumb, or are we wimps with no perseverance? I mean, what is that?
Well, okay. So here, first off, we need to be careful about how we define things, right? So there's a healthy type of control. Like in a
Mhm.
sense, I should be in control of my time, my schedule, my relationship to money, my, you know,
Mhm.
I should be in control of my sexuality and
Mhm.
honor and stay faithful to the covenant with my wife, right? So there's a healthy kind of control. The problem is, I don't know how they measure this, but I came across a study maybe a year or two ago that said the average Western person has 15% of control over their life that they think they do.
Wow.
So the problem is, like, if you were to diagram it out, say we have this much control over our life, we can control, you know, X number of things, make a list of the things you control. Then we have this much that's an area of concern, right? This are the things we care about. Anxiety is all of that area between things we can't control, but we have concern over. So, you know, I can control certain things about my 3 kids' behavior. I can control what time they go to bed. I can control whether or not they have a smartphone or social media, but I can't control whether or not they grow up to follow Jesus, whether or not they take their academics seriously, whether or not they become people of character, where they, you know, I can't control these things. I can influence them, I can pray toward them, I can advocate for them, I can lead by example, but I cannot control them. And that space is where we get into trouble. It's the breeding ground of fear. And fear is what causes most unloving behavior in our life. Because as long as we need other people or life to behave in a certain way for us to feel happy and at peace, we will constantly manipulate and harm, even in well-meaning intention, often the people that we love and care about the most, in order to force control upon our life for it to be what we think it needs to be for us to feel happy and safe. So I write it in the ebook. I write about the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And theologians call those the theological virtues virtues because they're not feelings. Like faith is not a feeling. Hope is not a feeling. Love is not a feeling. These are actual virtues, the inner disposition of the heart that we take on as we apprentice under Jesus. And they're theological in that they only make sense with God. Like hope does not make any sense without a God who is the king of the universe, who is ruling the kingdom of God, who is moving human history forward. Without that, hope is just no more than wishful thinking or, you know, denial or whatever. So I make the point that control is incompatible kind of with all 3. If you think about faith, controlling people do not live with a deep kind of trust and a steady just confidence in God's goodness, his involvement in their life. Rather, we are anxious and uptight and on edge. Hope, you know, if hope is, I love my working definition of hope is expectation of coming good based on the person and promises of God. Controlling people are not full of hope for God's future, but rather live in this kind of vicious cycle of planning for their future, followed by disappointment if and when their plans go belly up. And then finally, love, you know, above all, controlling people are not loving. They dominate and by they, I'm talking to myself here, dominate and manipulate and bully other people to get them to behave the way they think they need to behave in order to feel okay, rather than accept and delight in and serve and honor people as they are and honor their kind of freedom and dignity and just honor their agency in the world.
Mhm.
So that's why I think this is so at the root of what's wrong in the human condition. And really, it's all related to fear. You know, I've been thinking a lot about, most psychologists kind of attempt to categorize emotions. And the most common one is they break it down into like 7 or 8 emotions: the survival emotions, anger, disgust, rage, fear, and then the attachment emotions. But there is a number of psychologists that basically say there are just 2 basic emotions, that the entire human experience at an emotional level can be summed up in 2 words: fear and love. And
Hmm.
I think that's really interesting
Wow.
because of the line in
Wow.
1 John about how there is no fear in perfect love, but perfect love drives out fear,
Yes.
because we're the, you know, and so I keep thinking that really, what if the human journey can just be the spiritual journey, discipleship to Jesus, can just be summed up as the journey from fear to love, a decline in fear-based grasping for control, and a rising trust in God that manifests as surrender of our control over to God to become people of love.
Wow, that's amazing. That's your next book, huh? Fear and Love.
Fear and Love. Yeah, I've been thinking
2.0.
about that all year long. That's just become like a
Wow.
dominant idea in my mental maps, you know?
You know, grappling with that, whether you're a pastor or you're in the corporate world or working
Yep.
in whatever area, many people experience burnout. And I wonder if burnout has really a lot to do with control and realizing you just can't
Interesting.
control
Yes.
everything. I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced something like that. You know,
Oh,
there was
yeah.
once a 2-month period where I was just like down and out due to a certain event. But, you know, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I think that's really prophetic. You actually said that. So I came across a stat a few weeks ago that said, I know we're talking about everybody here, but that said 70% of pastors in America are looking for another job right now.
Oh
Not
my
another
goodness.
pastoral job, another like, I want to get out of the church job.
Wow.
So that,
Sell
again,
insurance. Yeah.
that's a separate Zoom call. But I was chatting to my therapist about this. I have this unbelievable Christian psychologist, 70 something. He's kind of who I want to be when I grow up. He's unbelievable. And he said something really profound. He said burnout, and this is true for pastors or for anyone, is a function of three things. So if you think of like three levers, you have responsibility, control, and reward. And he said burnout is a function of high responsibility, low control, low reward. Pastoring is normally high responsibility, low control. Unlike a business, you know, we don't create a product and then people, you're trying to get people to do something that's hard voluntarily, right? So we don't have control. We are responsible to help people grow and mature in Christ, but we can't control what they actually do. We can sow the seed, but we can't make it grow, right? But normally it's really rewarding. In 2020, for most of us, it is not rewarding at all. So you have high responsibility, low control, low reward. This formula, I think you could apply to young parents, you could apply it to business owners, you could apply it to pastors, anyone. When you're in that scenario, but it is exacerbated by people that have a low capacity for living in uncertainty. Because the higher your capacity to live without control, the less burnout is a psychological function far more than it is a physiological symptom. So there are people that if you're just working 100 hours a week, your body will break down. But there's a lot of people that work 30 hours a week in burnout, because it's about emotional energy, not about your kind of body as a whole. So that's where a lot of it has to do with your capacity to live without control.
Wow. I mean, I'm kind of listening to you and taking notes with my right hand here. I mean, that's very profound. I got to really
that's
think
passing
about
on
that.
somebody else's wisdom, but man, does that ring true to my own experience with burnout,
You went through a period of burnout a few years ago, or
Oh yeah, and honestly, this year has been really hard. I mean, David Brooks has this line about how he's always trying to write himself into a better life, and I have to be careful because as a writer or as a teacher, as a pastor, you can often preach to yourself, you know what I mean, the kind of life you want to live, and if you're not careful, that can become hypocrisy. So I pray it's not that, but I'm very honest in that little book I wrote that, man, this is a struggle for me. By personality, I'm, Myers-Briggs, I'm like an off the charts J. I'm a planner to a fault. Like before I sit down for my day off, I write out a plan for my day off, hour by hour. And this year has just shattered me. I mean, and it has just been the most difficult year. I've been a pastor 20 years, by far the most difficult year I've ever been through. And I'm so grateful for it because I think it is developing in me a capacity that was beyond weak before. And I'm praying that I come out of this, whenever this is over, with a whole new muscle in my character for living in uncertainty, for living without control, and still being able to be joyful and at peace. Because the reality is, when this is over, it'll be another thing. And you know what I mean?
Right.
And I think it'll get better after this, but when we're through this, it'll be another thing, and then it'll be another thing, and then even if the nation is doing fine, something will happen in our family, and then that's just life. It's a series of suffering.
That's true.
you
And
know?
I was listening to an epidemiologist from UCLA yesterday on a podcast, and she was saying, good chance there's going to be a COVID-20. This thing
Yes.
mutates. And it's like, oh,
Oh no, I don't want to
yeah,
hear
yeah,
that. Exactly.
yeah. So, but if I could just at this point affirm you, John Mark. I mean, you're being incredibly transparent, not only in your writings, but right now, and vulnerable in some senses. I mean, to just say that you went through a burnout, to say that there's nothing wrong in seeing a therapist, to keep it, keep things in perspective and going, and that's
I
so
see one
helpful.
every week, Dan.
That's so great, because I think for a lot of Christians, especially, they'll say, "Oh no, I
Yeah.
can't." There's a stigma to getting therapy.
Yeah,
There's
that's
a
really
stigma to
sad.
seeing a psychologist, and so thank you for saying that. At our church,
Yeah.
we have a long list of therapists that we recommend, and if somebody calls Hawaiian Ministries, we can recommend one too, because
Yes.
people want certain things. Has to be a believer. Need a woman. I
Yep.
want this district on the
Yep.
island of Oahu, and but we're really, we find it so helpful. And even spiritual directors, you mentioned that, or do you
Yes.
have a spiritual director too, or
I do. Yes.
yeah, and I have one also. And just the other day I said, "When's your birthday?" And he said, "December 25." And I said, "Oh, you're a great spiritual director for
Oh my
me."
goodness.
And
Wow.
he's a wonderful, for me, he's a wonderful Jesuit priest who is 82 years of age.
What a
So
gift.
just to have a nice
Wow.
Gandalf or a Merlin,
Yes.
uh, a
Yes.
wise Moses, or a Samuel in my life. So
Yes.
it's
What a gift.
but that was so important what you just shared, and because it is like we're in a 40-year journey in the wilderness, and
Yeah, it
whether it's
really is.
COVID or racial tension or wildfires, it's super,
Yes.
super, super hard.
But my point is just it's going to keep rolling, and I don't think, I mean, this was a bit especially bad year,
Right,
110%,
right, right.
but it's not like bad things will stop happening once we get a vaccine and whatever. Like, it is, life is full of pain and suffering, and if you're not careful, life just becomes this giant game of whack-a-mole where you just attempt to get emotional peace by solving the problems of your life. And like, all right, once we get the vaccine or whatever it is, once we get through COVID, then I'll be okay. Or once I get my business back, then I'll be okay. Or once I get married, then I'll be okay. Or once my kids are out of the house, then I'll be okay. And it's always once then. And you start to realize as you age that it's just like, it's whack-a-mole. You fix one problem and three more pop up, and you fix
That's
those
right.
and another one pops up. And at some point you realize that fixing problems is not bad. Like, if there's stuff that you can fix in your life, go fix it. That's great. Though it is a little bit of a function of privilege, but if you have that privilege, go fix it. But at some point you have to move from fixing problems to accepting that the deepest problems of our life cannot really be fixed. They have to be
Yeah.
embraced and accepted and forgiven and integrated into our life with joy and peace and hope. And so that's where I think this could really be a gift, to our generation, if we could, even maybe at a younger age than would be normal for us, if we could grow in our capacity to just accept the reality of our life before God and even learn to love it and thank God for it.
So how do we have that endurance and tenacity to, keep on keeping on? And, you mentioned the World War II generation. I think of my
Yeah.
parents. I'm at my home office right now, and we have this stone garage that's still from 1939 or 40, when my parents built this home, or built
Wow.
this garage. We had to remodel our home, and
Wow.
and I'm
Wait, so your
reminded.
parents did a remodel in the middle of World War II?
No, they
That
yeah,
you
they
must have
built it. They
amazing
built it
parents.
like 39. No, they built it like
Oh,
39, and
right
the war came
before.
in 40,
Oh.
41, and so it's around 39 or 40, around there. And so yeah, and also my oldest brother was born September and then came December 7th, 1941. So
Wow.
and when I
Wow.
think about what they went through, but my parents told me that, first of all, they were there when, I mean, they were in town when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and
Yes.
and then they had to put sandbags in front of their stone garage. That would be their bomb shelter. They would put
Wow.
newspaper over their windows so that at night an enemy bomber couldn't see where the island is. There no,
Wow.
before radar, right? And and of course there was some kind of rationing. My father worked for the Department of Treasury, but he was not
Mm.
Japanese, he was Chinese, but it was an age where you looked Japanese, you were
Yes.
hassled, and as you know, many were
Oh
put in
gosh.
camps,
Yep.
and
Brutal.
concentration camp likes, and their land was
Mm-hmm.
taken away, their money was taken away, and
Hmm.
that wasn't 1 year. That was
Yeah.
5 years, 5 years of World War II. And I know we can say, oh man, it's been a hard 8 months, but that's
Yes.
nothing like
It's
the quote
nothing.
unquote the greatest generation, right? And you made
Yes.
some observations which shocked me about the World War II generation, and you compared it to the millennials in your book. And can you kind of explain what you wrote and was thinking about?
Well, I mean, just sociologists argue they're the happiest generation we've had in recent memory.
But isn't
And
that shocking? Isn't that
isn't that
shocking
bizarre?
after what I just described?
Yes, the group of military vets, people that lived through horror, were actually one of the most resilient and happy generations in American history. And they had meaning, they had purpose, they built families, they had a lot of sex, made a lot of babies, you know, and happiness levels have been in decline since 1952 in the United States of America. And the Gen Z, even the generation coming up after me, my kids' generation, is, most sociologists argue, the most anxious generation in American history.
Hmm.
So you have a generation that lived through World War II that was pretty much calm and happy as a result on the backside of it. And you could say in spite of it, because of it, that's a whole other thing. And then you have a generation that's known a higher level of material prosperity, safety, and certainty than any other generation in American history that has a massive anxiety and mental health epidemic.
Hmm.
And I just wonder if those two things are connected, you know, that, and all of the data says this, that the more insulated from threat that we are as we grow up, often the more anxious we become, because we don't have a capacity for dealing with the uncertainty of life, the fears of life, the dangers of life, which are not going anywhere anytime soon, you know? So I just wonder, I don't know. I mean, COVID-19 is not World War II, you know, and the main difference is it has divided our nation even further,
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than brought us together. And that's the real major difference, is it has not brought most people together. And some of that's the nature of the disease, where, you know, the best thing we can do is be alone for the spread of the disease, which is the worst possible thing for our own emotional and spiritual development. So that's a real catch-22. And then some of it is kind of the political nature of our country and the culture wars right now, and the way that it's been exacerbated by that. So I'm not sure that this will have that effect on our generation, but here's what I do think. I think we all are getting an invitation right now from the Spirit of God, similar to the one that your parents got, you know, where we have a chance right now, rather than to fight and resist and get bitter or freak out over the uncertainty and our lack of control, to really accept it and embrace it and lean into it and really let God do a deep work to kind of terraform our spirit from the inside out, to really grow and mature us. You know, you asked, how do we develop perseverance? My understanding of James chapter 1 and Hebrews 11 and 12 and the other great passages on perseverance, Romans 5, is that you develop perseverance by persevering. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you develop muscle by working out with resistance training.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't develop perseverance by listening to podcasts or reading books. I mean, you're welcome to read my book. I just gave a sermon recently on perseverance. You can listen to it. I hope it will inspire your soul, but it will not make you a more persevering person. It can inspire you, it can move you, it can give you a theological paradigm. You become more, you grow in your perseverance muscle. I think if I understand correctly, I could be off here. Tell me what you think, Dan. I think you grow in perseverance by persevering.
Experience is everything, right? It's like
Yeah.
ground school in aviation,
Yes.
and then there's flight school. And
Yes.
the problem is people keep going to ground school over and over and over again, and they never fly. They never go
That's
to
a great
flight
analogy.
school.
Okay, so ground school is like, is that where they teach you all the theory
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
they
yeah.
explain to you and the
Yeah,
names for everything? But
aerodynamic.
yes, but you've never actually flown a plane.
You're right. It's in flight school that you really learn about it. All right, that's for your next book, baby.
Wow, I'm stealing that. I'm stealing that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and that's stolen from my associate pastor Tim Shaw, who's a pilot. So anyway,
Mm,
so I give credit to him for that. But Yeah, I'm just blown away by your whole thing on World War II and what you just said, and and of course they had the atom bomb in
Yeah.
45, right?
Can you
Hiroshima,
imagine living
Nagasaki.
with that fear? Yes.
Yeah, and why didn't they have that fear? And then we went on to Korea in the 50s, Korean War, and then of course the
Yep.
Cuban crisis in the 60s with John Kennedy. And it's like, is this going to start a nuclear war? And we still have that over the millennials, and they can say that's why we're so anxious. But no, the the greatest generation had that fear big time. They witnessed it in some sense. And
Yeah.
so, wow, that's like mind blowing. And so you can see, everybody, this is a book worth getting and thinking about these things. So I want to get back to what you're saying is, how do you think we are doing as a country, or as Big C, the church, in responding to COVID? Is there a sense of revival or renewal? Our buddy John Tyson kind of says, I think we missed it. We had a chance of being a pointing to, but he doesn't hear, at least in the news, like, gee, where's God in all of this, And or maybe some pulpits are saying God's mad at you, and that's why this is happening. So, what do you think? How is the church, Big C, responding to a sense of revival right now? Do you have
Hmm.
any sense up in Portland and all
You
your
know,
contacts?
I think I would be reticent to try to grade the church as a whole. I mean, I don't have God's vantage point. You know how it is with the church. All the bad actors get most of the press.
Yeah.
So the pastors and churches that we're most embarrassed by are the ones that we read the most about. And the churches that we would be most proud of are quiet and smaller and serving and staying together. I think early on, the church really rallied. I think in the spring, it was a beautiful moment for the church across the West, across the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think we really struggled through the summer, in particular through some of the racial tension, to
Mm-hmm.
know what to say, what not to say, how to move. That whole conversation changed.
Mm-hmm. And that
And
split the
then
church in some sense,
it
the
split the
racial
church
tension.
in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
and it made it really hard to engage because as Christians we care a ton about racial justice, but there were a lot of other very secular, very far left ideologies that were kind of embedded in the national conversation, which was thoroughly secular. And so it made it a little hard to, not hard to engage about, like, are you for or against racism as a Christian? That has a really clear answer. But there were some complexities in that I think it threw a lot of Christians off, threw a lot of people off. And so I think just in my most compassionate read would be the summer was a really hard time for the
Mm-hmm.
country.
It was.
And right now I think that we should be a little quick to expect more than perseverance. There are just times, like Jesus said to the church in Philadelphia in Revelation 2, you have little strength, but you've kept my word. You've been faithful to my name.
Mm.
And there are times, there's that beautiful line where I will not add more onto you except to just hold fast what you have till I come. And as much as I would love for the church to be out like leading a revolution and a revival, there are times when we're just scared and we're exhausted. The social isolation of this time, we cannot underestimate. The church is a gathering of people, and we cannot actually gather together, even in house churches and without breaking the rules. And that is a form of suffering. And we just need to be honest and I think compassionate about that. Could we have done better? Of course. But we're human and contingent and vulnerable and frail, and we have sin in our bodies. We could always do better. So, yeah, I think we could do better. But I still think persevering through the fact that your church is still in some way, shape, or form together, whatever that means,
Mm-hmm.
without even a gathering,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that ours is still, I think we should not call perseverance a failure. And we have to grapple with the sadder thing for me has been the culture as a whole. This is the first tragedy that I've lived through where I've heard zero national talk about returning to God.
Yeah.
9/11, it was still civic Christianity and it was still
Mm-hmm.
mixed with politics and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a nationwide, churches were packed for the next few months, and there
Right.
was national conversation about God, conversation about religion, absent everything right now is just science and politics. That's
Wow.
all it is.
I never thought
There's
about that.
there's
Very,
no
yeah.
there's no so people are losing their lives, they're losing their livelihoods, they're shut up inside, they're alone. And at a national level, there is no massive awakening to God. And so it's hard. I don't know what's happening at a micro level. I know what's happening at a macro level. At a micro level, there could be all sorts of stories. And that's what we're still praying for, is that there would be a breaking in our culture, and that all sorts of people would come out of this just reopening to God, realizing how mortal and contingent and fragile they are, and asking large questions. And that's where I really think the church has an incredible opportunity right now to be there when our friends and neighbors and family members who are secular people or are not Christians, when they start asking bigger questions, to be a hospitable place for them to ask those questions. I think that's the great invitation. So it could still be that right now God's calling us is to persevere, but that in a few months, as we start to come back together, the church's moment, her key crux of a moment will be, is she there in calm, quiet love, willing to listen and practice hospitality and welcome people who are asking big questions? That moment could still be coming.
You know, I never thought about that. 9/11, you're right. There's more. Let's get back to God. I think our attendance went up 20%.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, it's because we've lost that in-person access, that
Yes.
because my New York relatives who have lost many people, friends due to COVID, they say this is worse than 9/11 because at least we could have funeral services.
Yes.
We could go to the hospital to be with the spouse who had just lost a spouse.
It's horrible.
And we can't do that now. So they said this is far worse than 9/11. And yet I would say, on the other hand, John Mark, I think of two things. One is when I think of the church in China, that due to the Cultural Revolution, it was outlawed.
Mm-hmm.
You could not express Christianity publicly, and some were
Yep.
put in camps.
Yep.
And yet when they came out of the Cultural Revolution, they were 100 million strong. They had
Mm-hmm.
gone deep, hiding in house churches or wherever.
Mm-hmm.
And when they came back, they're fervent in their evangelism, and there's this revival
Yes.
happened, and now they're battling a new regime of trying to how do we express that when crosses are being taken down and everything. And so that was a nice response out of, again, this perseverance. You tell us we're not going to meet, we're going to go underground in small groups, and they came out stronger. And then I'm thinking one more thing is that I think our church is more involved in overt social justice than ever before. We're helping with food distribution in 2 Saturdays. 1,000 families we're going to help with the food bank. And 3 weeks ago we did another 750, and then there are hundreds here and there in smaller events. And our church has never gone out in such big ways to help the community. So that's the plus side, I think.
Yep. Absolutely. Churches have rallied. Our church has done the same. Their generosity to the poor in our city has been without peer in our history as a church,
Yeah. It makes me think of the Macedonian church, right? That helped the Jerusalem church, which was bigger. Macedonian church is suffering, persecuted, not necessarily wealthy, but they said, let us play, let us in. We're going to help raise money for the Jerusalem church. Like crazy. Crazy.
Yeah.
So we just have a few more minutes. I'm getting the countdown here, about 4 or 5 more minutes. You had mentioned a phrase, liminal spaces. That's not a phrase I'm familiar with, and holy uncertainty. What does that mean?
Yeah, so liminal space is used by developmental psychologists when they talk about a time or a season in your life where you're in between stages. So adolescence is kind of a liminal space. You're not a boy or a man or a girl or a woman. You're in that kind of liminal space, or college, where you're not living at home or living in your own home yet. You're in a dorm. You're in this kind of liminal space. When people that have lost their jobs right now are in liminal space, where they're no longer working for one employer and they're looking for the next job. They don't know where, they don't know what, they don't know how. They're in this like in between. One of the pastors I work with, Bethany, she calls it the neutral zone, when you're kind of in this weird space. And Pete Scazzaro. I don't know if you know him, but I love
Yes,
his
yes,
work. He calls it the confusing in between,
yes,
and writes about how it almost always is way harder and lasts way longer than you expect it to be. But
yes,
this space, developmental psychologists argue that it's actually a key time, adolescence, all these, like it can happen a million different times in your life. When you're in this liminal space between one thing and another thing, you're scared, you're open, you're vulnerable, but you're actually, there's something about the human psyche, you're more malleable, you're more shapeable in that time. So from a spiritual perspective, for our discipleship to Jesus, when we're in liminal spaces, and you could argue that all of life is a liminal space between Jesus' first coming and second coming. You could argue that's Advent, is that the church lives in what theologians call the time between the times. We live in liminal space. Our whole life is in liminal space. So when our autobiography is also in liminal space, which the whole world is one right now, where we're not in pre-COVID and we're not post-COVID. We're in this liminal space. We don't know how long it will last. It's lasting longer than any of us wanted it to. We don't know what we don't know what a post-COVID world will look like. We don't know what a post-Donald Trump world will look like. We just don't know what this future world will be. We're not here or there. We're in between. But this is actually where we're more open to change than ever before. And so if we can open to God right now, then it could be that God could do an even deeper work of growth and maturity into Christ-likeness in us now than in a normal time of life when everything is chucking along like we're supposed to.
great. Hey, one final question is,
Yeah.
what new tools or habits are you discovering and employing on the journey to trust and openness that you might want to share with our listeners?
Three very simple things that I'm just leaning into a lot right now to get through this season. One is just the practice of gratitude. Gratitude is the opposite of anxiety. It's a giving thanks for what you do have rather than a grasping for control of what you don't. And so just a lot of the practice of gratitude every morning, every night around the dinner table as a family, on the Sabbath, through the week. Gratitude, just really leaning into gratitude. Second would be just leaning into really deep relationships. We can't gather in hundreds of people. We can't even, at least where I'm at, we're not supposed to even gather as house churches, but we can gather in very small groups. And I've just gone deep with a few very close friends this year to just share the pain of the uncertainty and the lack of control and the grief and the loss and the fear, to have other people to carry that with you, so you're not carrying it alone and then escaping into unhealthy outlets for your anxiety. And the third thing is just trying to figure out the right language for it. Ignatius, if you have a Jesuit spiritual director,
Yes.
all this,
Yes.
he called it the practice of indifference, which that's not a great English translation, but he just meant like detaching from your need for your life to go a certain way to be at peace, and just acceptance and letting go. I think it's what Jesus was getting at with the imagery of take up your cross, death to self. So there's this little thing called the welcoming prayer that I pray every day. And it's just this little simple contemplative prayer exercise where it's kind of 3 steps to it. One is you just kind of do an emotional body scan where you just kind of, so that sounds weird, you just slow down and you kind of pay attention to what you're feeling. And it could be something physical, like I'm feeling shortness of breath in my chest, or I'm feeling an ache on my back of my neck. Or it could be emotional, I'm feeling really sad, or I'm feeling really anxious, or I'm feeling angry. Second step is you just like lean into that feeling or sensation. You don't like try to escape it or not think about it or change your mind or turn on Netflix. You just be present to it. And you just say, welcome, Holy Spirit. You welcome God, literally into the tightness in your chest, or the ache in your neck, or the anger in your heart, or the fear you have over the future. You just say, God, I welcome you. And then third step is you just pray this one sentence prayer. And it's so simple and I love it. It's just, I let go of the desire for safety, affection, and control. And I embrace this moment as it actually is.
That is fantastic. And
so I've just been doing that all the time.
My wife is so fast. She put it in the chat, the link welcoming prayer method.
There's a little booklet that is incredible called the
Okay.
Welcoming Prayer. Little white, has like a black and white picture of a bush on the front by
Okay.
I think it's the Contemplative Prayer Institute, somewhere back in the Midwest of America. It's this little 40-day journey. It is just stunning. Can't recommend it
Oh,
enough. I've been
nice.
living
Oh,
in that thing and giving it to all my friends. So
okay. If the team can find that, put that link up to everybody, that would be amazing. Well, it's so funny, John Mark. We have never really met or talked until just today. And we have so many parallels. I mean, one thing I teach my church a lot is St. Ignatius Daily Examen.
Oh, come on.
Yeah,
Yes.
and we
Teaching
printed
on
out the
that in a
cards.
couple of weeks.
Yeah, and basically we make it into an acronym of graft to graft it into your life. G is for gratitude, R is to review that day hour by hour, A is to apologize,
Yes.
and F is to forgive, and then T is just turn it all over to God and hold things lightly.
Wow.
Right?
That's
So,
nice. Can you,
yeah,
can I,
we can
this
send
is
you
beyond my prayer. Can you send me one of those?
yeah, we'll
We're
send you one of those.
we're
Feel
doing
free
30
to
days of prayer in
feel free.
January, and I'm trying to nail down an acronym for the examen to
Will
print out
do.
for our people. That would be
Feel free
amazing.
to adapt or not use. So great. Well,
Please
man,
send it.
a major thank you to you, John Mark, that you would spend an hour with us and with the people of Hawaii, and being willing to have this recorded so others can hear it later and see it later.
It's an honor.
And it's so great that you're going to be part of HIM 2021. It's just nice to give our people a preview of you coming, and everybody, you heard me say before, his books are great and very practical and easy to read and profound. Let's think, can I think of other words that start with P? But it's really pulsating. But thank you so much, John Mark, and I look forward to getting to know you better over the years. And it's so neat that we have common friends also. And everybody, his youth director is named Jaron Oda, and he's from Hawaii. And
that's right.
And another parallel is my former middle school coordinator, Christian Schroppel. He used to go to your church. So it's
really?
Like, there we go.
Oh, that's amazing. What a small world. Yeah, we have a deep love in our heart for not just Hawaii, but for Hawaiians. We love you guys and are so grateful for the gift you are to the world.
Yeah, and hopefully in HIM 2022, you'll be with us in person when we are all back at the Hawaii Convention Center, all 3,000 or 4,000.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I know it's hard to calendar right now, but that would be fantastic. Well, aloha. Thank you so much, John Mark.